Welcome to Spagtastic. In this lesson, we are going to learn about relative clauses. This is a level 5 skill. Let's begin by thinking about clauses. A main clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb. The subject of a sentence is the person or thing doing the action or being described, and the verb is the action. A main clause can stand alone as a sentence in its own right. Now let's think about subordinate clauses. A subordinate clause adds additional information to the main clause, and it is joined to a main clause as it can't make sense on its own. Let's look at an example. In this sentence, Theo ran to school because he didn't want to be late. The main clause is Theo ran to school, as it stands alone as a sentence and it has a subject, Theo, and a verb, ran. The subordinate clause is because he didn't want to be late. This gives us additional information about why Theo ran to school, but it wouldn't make sense by itself. It is joined to the main clause by the subordinating conjunction because. Here is another example. Dad took me to the shop as I needed new trainers. In this sentence, the main clause is Dad took me to the shop, as it has a subject, Dad, and a verb, took, and it stands alone as a sentence. The subordinate clause is as I needed new trainers. This gives additional information to the main clause, but it wouldn't make sense on its own. It is joined to the main clause by the subordinated conjunction as. Now let's learn about relative clauses. A relative clause is a type of subordinate clause that is used to give us more information about the noun in the main clause. Remember that a noun is a naming word for a person, place, animal, or object. A relative clause is introduced by a relative pronoun, such as who, which, where, when, whose, or that. Let's look at some examples of how relative clauses can be used in writing. In the sentence, the dragon, who was large and scaly, breathed fire, the main clause is the dragon breathed fire, and the relative clause is who was large and scaly. This is introduced by the relative pronoun who, and it tells us more about the dragon. Here, the relative clause has been inserted into the middle of the sentence to add extra information. Here is another example. I ran towards the playground that was at the end of my street. Here, the main clause is I ran towards the playground, and the relative clause is that was at the end of my street. The relative clause tells us more about the playground, and it is introduced by the relative pronoun that. Here, the relative clause has been added onto the end of the main clause. Here are some more examples. The old lady, whose grandson loved to visit, lived in a thatched cottage. The relative clause in this sentence is whose grandson loved to visit, and it is introduced by the relative pronoun whose. The relative clause tells us more about the old lady. Let's take a look at a final example. We didn't wear our coats on the walk, which was a mistake. In this sentence, the relative clause is which was a mistake, and it is introduced by the relative pronoun which. Now it's your turn. In this sentence, the boy ran around the park. Where could you add a relative clause? Why not pause the video and have a think for yourself? Here are some suggestions. We could have the boy, who wore blue trainers, ran around the park. Here, the relative clause is who wore blue trainers, and it is introduced by the relative pronoun who. Another possibility is the boy ran around the park when he had finished his homework. Here, the relative clause is when he had finished his homework, and it is introduced by the relative pronoun when. Both of these relative clauses give us more information about the boy. Here is a summary of our learning about relative clauses. Relative clauses give us more information about the main clause in a sentence. They begin with the relative pronouns who, which, where, when, whose, or that. And they can be at the end or in the middle of a sentence. They help us to improve our writing.